All right, we are back live. While Damien is getting some refreshments, we'll just go there. So we're on page 7, line 4. Is there anything on page 7 that stands out or that anyone needed another explanation on? Yes, Representative Parsons.
Mine just goes back for the 14, the highest earning quarters, which goes back to the average weekly earnings. I just, as a whole, and I'm not sure exactly how you fix it. I thought of it yesterday. We were talking about the possibility of using this program instead of UI for construction workers and things like that. It just got me thinking, if we're using if you're somebody who works at the golf course and then the ski area, or you have 2 separate jobs, if one of them is, substantially different wages, and you're using this benefit during that time, why would you get the wages from it just seems like most things, if you want to get the average, you spread it over the year and then you figure out their weekly earnings. If they get an average of their weekly pay, but we're calling it average weekly pay and then saying, and by that, we don't really mean average weekly pay. Highest 2 earnings.
Yeah, those are, is that a question for the definition or for the policy?
Both. So I'm just flagging it the first time, second time.
Yep.
Just
So Damien, we're just started, still on page 7 and definition 14. So the question,
Yes.
that, if I hear you right, Representative Parsons, it's the question over whether it should be the 2 high, so out of, let's just say that person worked for 4 quarters. Let's just make it simple first and say they worked for 4 quarters and they made $1,000 in one and $1,000 in another and $2,500 in 2 others. The way this is written is that the weekly payout for that claimant would be based on the 2 quarters,
2,500.
that were 2,500. But if the 2,500 came in the first quarter and the third quarter, as opposed, and they may have changed jobs along the way, is that what you're talking about? Is this, why not? Why isn't it the average wage of their current job?
Possible. I mean, there's 1,000 variables, just like anything. Like you said, like you're depending on, because it's not a calendar year, it's the past
4 quarters.
Past 4 quarters. So yeah, I guess you hit all of them in that, doing it that way. I just don't like the idea of, if you say you're going to get paid on your average weekly earnings, and then say, oh, and by average weekly earnings, we don't actually mean average. We mean your highest 2 quarters, and then average of those during that.
Okay, let's talk about that when we get to the policy
So-
part. Yeah.
I think one of the reasons, correct me if I'm wrong, Damien, this is pretty much how UI works, right?
Yeah, this is based on the unemployment insurance law. That's where it came from, but there's no reason why you have to be attached to it. You can calculate it any number of different ways.
Yeah.
We just use that as a model.
Anything else on page 7?
Yes, I'm just confused about the grammar in 15. Because it start out saying in loco parentis means a child, whom an individual had responsibilities. And then after those qualifying phrases, or an individual who had such responsibility for the, so
Yeah, so it's a person who stood in loco parentis. You can take leave to care for them if you're an employee. So
The individual who had.
yeah.
So I think
I guess I'm confused because in line 9, it says, seems to me the child is subject to that.
Yes, you're exactly right. I will fix the grammar there.
So it's an individual who has day-to-day responsibilities for a child. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Qualified individual is just determining how someone has, if they've been qualified or not, and they can receive the benefit. Qualifying exigency is related to military leave.
Yep, and we're just cross-referencing the federal definition.
Yep. And so in 29 CFR, et cetera, there is a definition of covered active duty service. Covered active duty service was highlighted in the administration's FMLI fast fact sheet, and just, I'm assuming that it's.
Yeah, so.
It implies that it's in 29 CFR, so.
Yeah, the qualifying exigency is, it's covered active duty, calling it covered active duty service. It's really exigencies related to active duty service. So they can involve things like having to arrange for childcare, or your child having to switch schools, or having to move your household, or place things in storage, all sorts of things that come up if you get a short notice that you're being deployed for 6 months or a year, something like that. And so that's really what it is. It's not actually the active duty itself. It's the things that happen to your life when a family member is called into service. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
That just brought up a question for me, and I'm sorry if we've discussed this and I completely am forgetting it. Say I'm married to somebody who is active duty and they get relocated. We're currently in the state of Vermont and have to move to, say, Texas. Would I qualify if there's no expectation of me continuing work for the employer after the 12 weeks is over?
So I'm going to stop my share here because I need to pull up the federal regulations.
You want a wheelbarrow?
So I think what we're getting into here is if there's really two different things at play. So one is I have to take a short-term leave from work and I'm coming back to my job in
Yes.
Vermont. But it's in relation to this active duty. To make arrangements to ensure that everything is set for our family. The other is I'm leaving my job because my significant other has been transferred to Camp Pendleton in California, and we're moving across the country. So the unemployment insurance program covers the instances when someone has to leave their job
Because of military.
because of military service. The qualifying exigencies, and I will send this to Ron to post later on. But that really is related more towards the issue of that sort of short term, and it can be anything 6 months or less.
Okay.
That's related to active duty service where you're going to come back to your job. And just pull up. So
You'll provide that as a.
I will.
Watch list thing.
yeah, I'll put it, I'll get that out to the committee while you're on the floor this afternoon.
Okay.
just gonna email the regulation to myself right now, though, so I can send it to you later.
Okay, section, definition 19 is safe leave. These are all of the, any questions on how this was framed? This is new language. When leave may be granted, and this is specific to, this is language that we would see at the very least in, when it comes up in the Safe Leave Act, or the Safe Leave portion of this bill, that it would be inserted into our PFLA language, at the very least for job protection. But this is just defining what we mean when we say safe leave.
Okay.
Page 9, self-employed individual. Self-employment income. Those are standard.
Yeah, I think the question here was whether you want to add in the restriction about no employees other than the owner. So I'll just flag that for a policy discussion.
You just might want to check. You can either search it or check it with Ron. I mean, again, it's probably going to be like 27 pages of. Whereas we're just talking about self-employment income has the same, whenever we have it, it's the same meaning.
Do you want me to just go ahead and send the committee those statutes? Okay. We'll send all cross-reference statutes.
Because we know that people will ask.
It's also good for everyone here. If any of you have been having trouble falling asleep at night. The Internal Revenue Code, which is the cross-reference for self-employment income, is a very good read late at night if you need to just get some shut-eye, so.
I tried to listen to the audiobook version of it.
Are you speaking on the audiobook?
Yes, there's a lawyers association that does with the USC code as other people do with the James Joyce novels, Dubliners or something like that. They just read a paragraph.
Right,
No one knows what they're saying, but
that's my side gig. I do voiceovers on readings of the US code. I do them in my soft monotone though, so.
So that when
I saw
you
those.
speed it up, it sounds.
Yeah, they got a 2X. It's kind of like on Spotify, they have the wavelength meditation tapes, where you can white noise or brown noise.
Yeah.
All right. Enough of that with the,
All right.
so we are at 22, serious illness or injury is,
And I sent you the serious health condition definition yesterday. Again, that's already posted on the committee's webpage. And that was flagged as a policy discussion.
sexual assault and stuff, and the U.S. Armed Forces just defines, yes, the Space Force is officially a part of the U.S. Armed Forces.
I'm sorry, going back to.
Oh, the healthcare
line
provider, yeah.
14, instead of physician, healthcare provider, right?
Yeah, if you look at the serious health condition definition, there's a little bit more to it than that.
If you can provide a draft so that we can review it.
Yep, so I will just draft that up as an alternative language piece. And yeah,
Okay, thank you.
it's marked up. Yeah, US Armed Forces, that's the standard definition currently.
Again, we have a very limited Coast Guard presence. We have, we certainly have National Guard as a standard. That's our military presence. State, however, we may have Vermonters who are serving in the armed forces in these other fields. So
Yeah, and it's worth noting, As of the present time, I don't believe the Space Force has a reserve component, but I've included them in the list in the event that their reserves get split out from the Air Force reserves. So. Anyway.
And then wages, I assume that 26 USC 3401 is another pithy
Exciting.
definition.
Equally riveting.
Yeah, I will.
And while I was making allusions to some of these definitions being relevant to the safety portion of the unpaid active, there are a portion of what we're proposing to add to. I mean, this is section 1, so this is being added to the new PFLI section. So just to be clear about that. All right, take a deep breath. Are we good with definitions? That was it. So we can go to section 2052. We'll do this a section at a time. Again, we've had the walkthrough of it. We've had some discussions. We've had some questions about each of these sections. This is language that sets up the division. I want to focus for a second on line 16, which is implying staff as necessary. Some of the, and I think this is a policy decision. So just, we can think about it and come back to it in the next couple of days. But in the case of the testimony we just received this afternoon from DFR, where they were implying that they can't do it, or it would require time, energy, capacity, and it's a new thing. If we do choose to change the language with respect to DFR, this is the language that allows the division to undertake that responsibility to hire a person or persons or individuals, employees who would be able to cover that which DFR is saying that they will if they're supported. But the testimony today was leaning towards, as we're presently constituted, we can't do this. And everything else was conjecture about what it would take to get there. So I just wanted to point that out in terms of the director's.
Yeah, it's also worth noting that the bill as introduced was drafted without a section designating additional staff. And that was done because we didn't have an estimate of what it would take. So that's often something that is done once it gets to the appropriations committees, is you start getting estimates of how many FTEs do you need, and then we start budgeting out that money. So that was left out of the understanding that full-time equivalents, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
But yeah, how many full-time equivalents, or are there specific positions you'll need? So if you look back at older bills that made it to the finish line of at least getting voted out of the General Assembly, you'll see that they all include an appropriation and staff. This bill has the placeholder appropriation, but it doesn't have staff because there was just no specific estimate, which you really need the expertise of the agencies to come in and say, this is what I think we need to at least start.
So clear on 2052? Okay, 2053 is the creation of the special fund.
And the program.
Yeah, and so Section A basically just says that the insurance program is established within the Division of Family Medical Leave, which was created in the previous section. Special fund in B is set up pursuant to existing law.
Is the one difference from existing law, I mentioned this in the walkthrough, is that all interest earned on the fund balances would be credited to the fund. Typically, special funds, that interest goes back to the state. But for some special funds, we credit the interest. If it's a small special fund, crediting the interest costs more than the interest you earn for a fund this large where we're expecting it to potentially be handling $90 million a year in contributions or something like that, if I remember the JFO testimony. Don't quote me, refer to JFO. But where you're expecting it to handle tens of millions of dollars, that you've got an economy of scale where crediting back the interest may help with the solvency of the fund.
It also, just to point out, line 5 is, lines, starting at line 4, the fund may be expended by the director, which is in the treasury, and the commissioner of taxes for the administration of the program. That's permission given to, in this case, Commissioner Bolio, but the commissioner of the tax department, to address some of the concerns capacity-wise and software-wise.
Yep.
For the division of taxes.
Yeah, and if you choose to keep DFR in, that would be, it should read the commissioners of taxes and of financial regulation.
Okay, so just punch list that as I mean, that's, and again, going back to the testimony from JFO, one of the harder parts was, they weren't able to say exactly how much something was going to cost until they understood what the policy was going to be. And, we're going to present a set piece, but it's going to change. I'm presuming it's going to, regardless, it'll until this bill gets to its final points, they won't be able to provide a more accurate estimate until the policies are in place. So just as a reminder to us. Damien, repeat line 15 for us.
Yes.
But just explain that.
So line 15 allows the director to seek out and accept outside monies. So it is standard language. It says gifts, donations, and grants from any source, public or private, to be dedicated for deposit into the fund. So there's two things there. The first is, so the director is basically seeking money to go into the fund. The fund can only be used for the purposes specified. So there are limitations. This isn't just a seeking out funding for the division to do whatever it wants with. But when we were going through the walkthrough, it was highlighted that there may be concerns about the idea of gifts or donations, particularly, and possibly grants. So grants could include something like a grant from a nonprofit foundation or from the federal government to update the computer system or do something like that, which could be helpful. But there were concerns that, well, what if the grant comes from a private insurance company that's offering a product in the state that's, being put forward as a private plan? Would they get special treatment? So I think that was one of the concerns that was expressed here, where you've got a regulator potentially accepting outside monies, which could create at the very least the appearance of pay to play. So
Flag it. Sit with the committee. And there's a different texture to this about this line for this purpose or in this place than say when we had the same line in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where some individuals may, and these similar questions arose, but it seemed less. It just seemed less important because the thought is that there might be philanthropists who would donate to the Truth and Reconciliation Fund, and it will be separated enough from state government at that point. There may be influence or pay to play on some level that would have to be determined by the director who might receive it or not. This seems, I don't know outside of taxes how other people donate I mean, grants from the federal government is important, so covering that is gonna be important, but it's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and we do allow some programs to apply for private grants and things like that, but it's something where you can have concerns, particularly if it's an entity that's going to be in a regulatory position, and it doesn't restrict gifts, for example, from insurance carriers or employers in the state. Then you have the potential for a pay-to-play situation. So that we can keep, strike, or modify that language when you're thinking about it.
All right, 2054 is contributions, rates, and collection. Obviously, at the bottom of the page, it states it's 0.58. We know that the current estimate is 0.55. We should change that, and as we go along, if it gets different, then it'll be changed. Page 12.
Did you want to touch on the Commissioner Bolio's comment from this morning about concerns about employers paying a portion of an employee's contributions?
That's on page 12.
So it could either be on page 12 or in the refund section if you keep it. His concern was that if employers are potentially paying different rates, it'll be hard for the Department of Taxes to backtrack and figure out refunds if the refund is based on the employee's contributions.
Sure. And I think that there's right. So he was saying about setting up it'd be potentially easier to set up a credit. I think from a policy perspective, the question of 25,000 and below is for us to decide, do we want to exempt? I mean, essentially the desire is to exempt Vermonters who make less than $25,000 a year from this premium. Commissioner was saying it's very expensive to refund the money with the way that it works right now, is what I heard when I walked in. So we will spend time on that issue about whether we want to continue that exemption or put different bumpers on it. We talked about on page 12, we talked about line 5, where the employer may elect to pay some or all of the employee's portion. Covered wages in E is saying that people will be making contributions on salaries on incomes up to 2 times the maximum Social Security contribution in the benefit base.
Sorry, can we back up just to the top of the page B? Somebody, I don't remember whether, I believe it was Cameron, said that with
Unpaid contributions.
Unemployment insurance, the employer pays half, but so it's not unemployment. Something where the FICA.
Yeah.
Employer pays half, the employee pays half, but the employer is responsible ultimately for ensuring that those payments are made. Do we need to clarify?
Yeah, we can add that language. I would add it somewhere besides B, but there is at the end of the section, so on page 14, lines 9 through 11, it says we've got one subsection there that addresses employers with approved private plans. And then I think we could just add a subsection E below that I'll think about it where it goes, because it could also go just at the end of subsection. Anyway, I'm thinking this through on the fly, but yeah, the language they were asking for is basically that says employers shall be responsible for any unpaid contributions.
Right.
So that an employee is not left on the hook if their employer took the money and did something with it instead of withholding it like they're required to.
We had a question from Commissioner Bolio about line 14. His question boiled down to there's covered work income where they live or versus where they work. I think Representative Parsons talked a little bit about that as well. Line 18,
Yep, so we define covered work income as self-employment work income. Yep, and then we define self-employment work income as under the federal definition. Yeah, so that that actually does need clarification. And it at a very least, we should clarify about whether it's earned in Vermont. So I think that's my understanding of the intent, but they'll flag that as we need to clarify where the location is at a minimum.
all right. Small letter B on line 18 talks about that the General Assembly shall establish the rate. And number 2 says that the rate shall be determined, well, that the director shall report to the General Assembly rate necessary. I'm wondering, just from a linear standpoint, should we switch those sections where it says the report comes in and says you need to raise this much money, and then it said then the General Assembly raises that much money? Is there any tactical or practical reason not to, or to change it?
Well, so there's a couple of things. One, the Commissioner Bolio highlighted that, and this was because I live in the unemployment insurance world and not the income tax world. Unemployment insurance, the tax rates are set on a fiscal year basis, and workers' compensation administrative rates too. It's July 1 to June 30. But income taxes are January 1 to December 31. And so if you're having the tax department administering collections, adjusting the rate so it coincides with the tax year makes more sense. So that would be one change there on lines. Anywhere it says fiscal year, it should say calendar or next tax year, or calendar year. The other thing, and this is a bigger philosophical question for the committee, is do you want the program coming back every year requesting permission to change the rates, or proposing a new rate? Because you could set it up so it's each year they come in with a report by whatever date you set, February 1, April 1, with a proposed rate, and then you pass through a housekeeping bill. Workers' comp, every year they come in, they request a housekeeping bill. The issue with that is that there have been a couple of times where it's barely made it across the finish line because it gets put into a bill that is controversial for whatever reason, or becomes controversial. And so we have definitely had past years where we've had to find a vehicle for that rate to get it across the finish line at the end of the year, because otherwise they don't have an approved rate. So this year, the Department of Labor has proposed language that would allow the rate to default to the rate it was in the previous year if the General Assembly doesn't take action, which would also allow us to not take action most years because it stays pretty steady. That's
Somebody announces every year that the rate should go down. But the work, I mean, workers' comp in the last 7 years, the rate has gone down.
Well, yeah, so we have steadily, every few years, it goes down a little bit. But it stays at about the same amount, and it's like 1.4% on premiums for workers' comp policies, so it's not a huge amount, and that's used to administer the whole workers' comp program in the state. This one here, the alternative approach, so you could do, like I just mentioned, where you keep this language, but if you want to have that security, you add in if the General Assembly doesn't take action, it'll default, so at least the taxes keep flowing in. You could just set the rate in statute and then have to do legislation whenever it's necessary, just say nothing. The other option that some states have done is they set the base rate and they say that the department or the division that's administering the program, they give them guidelines for how to determine the rate, and they adjust the rate each year and report back. And then if you're unhappy with that, you can take further action. And the other thing is they're usually capped. You can't adjust past here or here. And I think there's usually not a lower bound, but there's always a higher bound because of concerns for the program solvency. If your rate keeps going up over time, there's a problem with how you've designed
So
the
the legislature
mechanism.
change in the end, right, if it exceeds.
Yeah,
If it's threatening to exceed.
It's usually like a 1% cap. But I could show you basically multiple options of the language in the next draft, and you could look at them and think about them if you want to do that.
Sure.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to stop there. This committee, before we go out on the floor, just one announcement to make on a different subject is I've asked Representative Burrows, Justin Tangent, and Lamont to work together with members from Human Services on some of the GA issues that we've heard about, some of the hotel housing stuff, and you know, it's so they're working as a subgroup. They're meeting whenever they can. Their work product, when it's done, will come forward to us and to Human Services to perhaps either as a bill or perhaps be inserted into a bill, and we'll have full testimony on it and full exposure of what that work product is. Just wanted to let you know, and that's something that's a housing related. When we're done with family leave, we're going to shift to a housing bill. So just wanted to make sure that was out on the table.